So thanks for being with us. For those of you who were here yesterday, you know that we zoomed in on Italy and then on Germany, which everyone is talking about at the conference. But today we're upping the stakes and we are going to talk about all of Europe. So during the German panel, some people actually risk predictions on when adult use is going to be effective in Germany, and some said 2023, I think, up to 2026. And I thought that was really interesting to see this range of predictions. And here, before venturing into risking making predictions, I really want to get the context on how you forecast the market. We have a great panel here because we have people who have perspective both on the UK, continental Europe, and America. But I just want to go straight into it, and I'm going to ask Nikolaas how forecasting cannabis compares to forecasting other markets, because I know you've already worked on beverages and other sectors, so how does that compare?
Well, there are far less data available on cannabis, of course, especially in the European market, because it's a completely illicit, illegal market. So it is a bit second guessing. Now, luckily in the US and Canada, we have already a legal market, and we can draw some conclusions from what we're seeing there in terms of frequency of consumption, in terms of spread over different age groups and so on. So it is mainly using those data and projecting them into the European market that I would say.
So is it more black market that you're using for projection, or other markets, if you have to say one or the other?
The total market, because even in Canada you have very great studies from Health Canada about the total market, including the illegal market. So it is using all that data. Same you have in Florida, same you have in maybe to a slightly lesser extent in California, but there is data out there on consumption patterns. Yeah.
And Pablo, I want to ask you about your perspective. I mean, comparing America, especially the U.S. and Canada with Europe.
Yes, thank you. So look, I mean, when we think of forecasting markets, we like many other people have learned the hard way, right? That it's better to think in terms of scenarios, because the 3 A's drive the size of a market, right? Access, affordability, assortment, and of course there's a lot of nuances to those three terms. But that's what drives the size of a market. What strikes me in the case of North America, when I think of Canada and the US, on what we call the recreational market, is that the numbers are so different, right? And it's not just because one market is older than another one. You think, for example, Colorado, and we cannot attribute this to tourism anymore. In Colorado, the per capita consumption is about $400, right? At the low end of the spectrum, if you want in a North American context, is Canada with $90. California, about $135. But what I'm trying to say here is that if we try to forecast, you really have to look at those 3 A's, because that's going to determine the size of the market. Again, maybe more color. New Mexico, it's a state that just legalized cannabis in the US starting April, and it's already on a per capita consumption basis at the level of California, right? So that's on the recreational side. So when we think of Germany, if the question is about, how we can extrapolate that, and again, we know every state is different, every country is different, so there are cultural differences, but more important than that is the 3 A's that I talked about. When I think of Germany, I think on the recreational side, the number that gets thrown around, 5 years out, I think it's 400 tons, right? 400 tons today, medical is about 20, so that's 20 times bigger. So when people tell me 400 tons, I mean, they ask me, like, what do I think of that number? I say, it's reasonable, it's realistic, and it's probably on the low end, right? Because again, and I'll stop with the numbers and the details, but 400 tons, about 16 euros per gram, that's about, call it, 320 million euros, right? 6.4 billion euros. But on a per capita consumption, that would mean that Germany, 5 years out, would be about $80, right? Canada, which we don't consider a market that has developed so well, it's around, like I said before, 90 per capita, right? So the numbers that are getting thrown around for Germany, to me, seem reasonable, realistic, but we cannot make projections yet because, we assume that the rules will come out in 2013, in 2023, they will agree on the system, and 2024 sales would start. Again, we have to think what's the probability that happens, but I think it's more than 50%, of course. But if you tell me in terms of size, that number of 400 tons to me seems reasonable. I'll stop, and I'm sure we'll touch on other things, but in terms of the medical market, again, I understand every market is different, and the European markets are very more of a pharmaceutical nature compared to the US market, the North American market. But, in the case of Germany, call it 100,000 patients, right? That's 0.1% of the population. In Arizona, Pennsylvania, 4%. Florida, 3%. I know that those are more wellness markets, very different. Anxiety, chronic pains are conditions you can get cannabis for. So we cannot extrapolate that to Germany, right? But, 0.1, Canada has been medical since 2001, 0.7% of the population. So Germany could be 7 times bigger than it is today if you take the Canadian numbers, right? So again, I'll stop, but the bottom line is that when you're thinking about projections, we look at the comps and we try to understand the reality and the key drivers for each market.
That's helpful, thanks. Sascha, so you were agreeing, right? Are you tabling on the same predictions, personally?
Yeah, kind of. The 400 tons for the recreational market in Germany is a number which you often hear. It stems actually from an economic study from Justus Haukapp. I think it's even a bit shy. It went from prevalence data and then calculated average use. And if we compare that usage rate with what actually happens in the markets which are legalized, I think we are shy with the 400 tons, which would translate into 5-6 billion. So I think we are more looking at a market of 10 billion or even beyond that. And then also medical, we keep talking about recreational. So the medical market in Germany is just at its beginning. So 100,000, 120,000 patients, prevalence data much below of what we would expect. Germany is fully reimbursed, so no need, let's say, to slow down growth. We had a bit of less growth during COVID times, as innovative medicines were maybe not that prescribed, but we see it picking up again. So I think that market alone has a lot to grow, and then the recreational market on top of that.
Yeah, so I fully agree with Sascha. I think the 400 number, there's one study who once mentioned 400 tons, and since then everybody uses 400 tons as the market size in Germany. If we compare figures what Pablo was saying earlier, and also my own research, I come at around 160 grams on average per user in Canada, in Florida, in California. If we use that to the 5.7 million users in Germany, well, you come at 950 tons. So, okay, it might not be 950, but it's more in that direction rather than in the 400. I don't see any reason why the German average cannabis consumer would consume only half what their North American counterparts do.
So, Nick, your perspective is also on capital markets. How are the markets predicting the market?
It's interesting times. I guess we were last here in person nearly 3 years ago. And at that point, there weren't many publicly listed companies, and I was forecasting quite a few. And we had an initial wave who some have performed business-wise very well, but the stock prices, as the gentleman to my left will tell you, are not performing well. So access to capital to build out the European market is an issue. And it's an issue, particularly if Germany does go adult use, how that's going to play across the rest of Europe and the markets, and whether the markets will move with the fact that the largest economy in Europe has taken the step to move the conversation forward. Because at the moment, given the rules that are currently out there, any business that wanted to do business in that German market would not be able to list in London, which is ludicrous. And yeah, that's a conversation that I hope will move forward as the market moves forward and as the legislation passes through the various German hurdles. So at the moment, you've got the largest potential European market offside as far as the UK regulator is concerned, which just makes no sense. So, from my end, we're still totally focused on the medical market, and hopefully that conversation will move on and the FCA will work out what's happening. It took me 2 years to get the first company listed. It will probably take a similar length of time for them to realise what's going on. But that's the perspective that I've got from the public markets, and certainly at the moment funding is a challenge for all of these businesses. And so where the funding is going to come to grow that level of product for the market will be fascinating, especially depending on what regulation they go down. If we need EU GMP for the adult use market, we're going to be in an interesting position, because I can't imagine that you're going to find that level of tonnage EU GMP in 3 years' time. So, from a public markets point of view, I think there's some growing up to do again, but we'll get there. But at the moment, it's pretty difficult.
And throwing back at you on the forecasting angle, so what's your forecast in terms of timing of that happening?
Well, slowly, because everything happens slowly here. The rest of the industry moves at lightning speed, and the regulators move quite slowly. But it can't be the panel before, which I found fascinating, about moving the conversation forward in the UK politically. I think it will become a focus for the next election. Clearly, that will have an impact on regulators and how they're thinking. I would hope that the regulators are watching what's happening in Germany with interest, and I'm sure at some point I will remind them that they should be.
So talking about what's happening in Germany, Sascha, what's your forecast on what's going to happen, how long it might take? How optimistic are you about it?
So I guess you asked about recreational use. So yeah, I think the aligned date is now the beginning of 2024. So what we hear is that the House Minister has announced a so-called reference draft for end of this year, which will then take months to go through the different discussion groups. I think it's okay to assume that mid of next year we will have the law passed, and then it will take 6 to 9 months to regulate and to make sure that the market kicks off. So our assumption is beginning of 2024, and we heard yesterday Ms. Lütke kind of confirming that. So we are very confident to see a market opening at the beginning of 2024. Mm-hmm. That's the date we are preparing for.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to throw to the analyst perspective here, and do you also see this prediction, and how, more specifically, when do you see maybe adult use overtaking medical in Europe?
For the first part of your question about the timing, Germany, yes, somewhere middle 24 seems to be possible after all the positive vibes that we hear from the politicians. But of course, it will leave very little time for companies to prepare, because 6-9 months for setting up production, distribution, retail, we have no idea how it is going to look like. So it's going to be difficult. So we'll see how if companies are actually able to fulfill that demand. But whatever it can grow very quickly. Sorry, we're disturbed here by somebody who's speaking there. I don't know. It can grow very quickly. If you look at U.S. or North America, in Canada, for example, it took 7 quarters for the adult use market to overtake the illicit market. And that is then in a very heavily taxed market. California, a very taxed market. Well, after 5 years, they're only 35% share of that total market. But other Colorado, Oregon, after 6-7 years, it's 85-90% of the total market. So it can go very quickly. And given that the adult use consumption is a multiple of the medicinal cannabis consumption, well, an overtaking can happen very quickly, after 1 year, 1.5 years, potentially even. Thank you.
So, Pablo, based on what you've seen, do you think it's going to happen faster in Europe than in Canada, for instance, or?
Yeah, so again, going back to the 3 A's, right? when I think of the German market...
Take them again, please.
Right, and when I think
accessibility.
Yeah, and when I think of the three parties within the coalition, right, I think one key theme is safety, right, protection of minors. Another key theme has been these very bullish tax revenue projections they are making, right? So when I hear that, I think, is that going to mean there's going to be limits on potency, right? Does that mean there's going to be limits on the type of formats you have available? Those type of limits have proven to hurt market development, right? We saw in the case of Canada at the beginning. Obviously, on the tax revenue side, if taxes are high, that's going to affect affordability. Then you have the assortment side, which of course has to be determined. You know, are they going to issue more licenses for local production? Are they going to import, you know, from which countries, recreational markets or other medical markets? So there's a lot of things that are still undefined, right? But again, I will go back to the point that although we don't know those rules, you know, on the question you asked before about capital raising and all of that, I would know that, you know, there are companies in Canada, licensed producers like Aurora and Tilray, which are listed in NASDAQ, that have a significant exposure to Europe. And we see them as plays, not only on the North American market, but also on the European market, right? In the German market, there's only 3 domestic licensed companies to produce domestically, Tilray, Aurora, and Demecan, which is private. And oh, by the way, you know, Demecan is doing a private raise, and apparently they're not having a lot of problems raising that capital, right? But the question is going to be, who's going to be there down the road, and are you going to issue 10, 20 licenses for domestic production? How quickly can they ramp up? And then what happens with imports? But the last thing I would say is that, of course, there's so much that we don't know how the regulators are going to think about this. But at least in the US, in my opinion, the lack of action at the federal level has contributed to significant industry consolidation, right? The US MSOs, as we call them, the multi-state operators, the top 20 back in 2018 were like, call it 18% of the industry. Today, they are more than 50%, the top 20. And we project that in 2 years' time, and the status quo, without federal legalization, they could be 70%, right? So the point that was raised before, if European-based companies have difficulty accessing capital, then, you know, who's going to tap that, right? It could be those Canadian companies like Aurora and Tilray that are listed in NASDAQ that could have an opportunity to raise capital. The last thing I would add, there's so much correlation in the stock markets for cannabis right now, pretty much all driven, well, by macro factors, but most of all, driven by the expectations of reform in the US market, right? And of course, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're Aurora and Tilray and you have this huge opportunity in Germany, a market that will be 20 times bigger, and they can be significant players there, then those are stocks that people should be thinking at, right? But right now, those stocks are depressed because people don't know what's going to happen in the US. That doesn't make sense, and we think of that as an investment opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So I saw you reacting on capital markets.
Yeah, I think it will be ironic that undoubtedly the European market will be catered for by the large US-listed companies, certainly in the short term, unless we see capital markets in Europe move quickly to facilitate those companies. So, yeah, what you'll probably see is multi-state operators from the US being the recipients of any new licenses, because they're the ones who are going to be able to fund what they need to do if new licenses are issued. So it's interesting times. Those big companies, the 2 out of 3 have those licenses, and they are well funded, and NASDAQ is, I would imagine, open to future funding if needed. So as usual, you're going to have Europe behind North America when it comes to access to capital for European companies. And probably therefore having to go and look at NASDAQ.
So Tilray was mentioned a few times. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I agree to all what was said. So yes, we feel well prepared. There's a reason that we have put 2 GMP certified sites onto the ground in Europe. And to your comment, we would be delighted to supply the German recreational market with GMP certified material. So I don't see an issue there. And I think it's important that also the recreational market will be supplied with high quality material. Otherwise, we will not take over the illicit market, which is the basic goal of it. So yes, we feel well positioned. We do believe that being part of the medical ecosystem will help us to then also be prepared and be positioned if the market becomes legalized. German policy is very open right now, also to conversations, for sure in an absolutely legal frame, but we're having those conversations and they're also listening to the needs of companies. So again, I couldn't agree more. I do feel Tilray well prepared, leading the medical market, and then also striving for leadership in the recreational market.
I mean, one of the things we haven't discussed, and I think is certainly interesting for the UK at the moment, given the limitations, is that medical market and the size of that medical market. Everybody understandably is focused on Germany and adult because it's a huge market and it's a game changer. But certainly from clients of mine that I speak to, and I don't know, I presume the Tilray experience is similar, the medical market is increasing week on week, month by month, and that's something that we've campaigned passionately about, and providing access to that funding. So really, I guess from my end, because I'm not allowed to make forecasts, those get me into trouble, how do you see the medical market ex the German recreational market? Because I think that's really interesting from my point of view.
I think that's an analyst question.
It is.
So,
and it's a good one.
So if we look at the North American markets and the Canada and the US, and let's forget about what medical registered patients are. In every state or in Canada, you have about 6% of the population who consume cannabis for medical reasons. For example, in Canada, where the past 12 months usage rate is 21%, of that 21%, there's 15% for recreational use and 6% for medicinal use. And that is why in states in the US where it stayed a medicinal market for a long time, like Arizona or like Florida, we see those numbers climbing up to, as Pablo said earlier, 4% in Arizona, currently 3.5 or 3.6 in Florida. And I think at TrueLeaf, the largest player in Florida, well, they're looking for 1 million patients, and that would be just around 5% of the Florida population. So getting to that 6%, that is somewhere the usage rate. And then depending on the countries, how it is reimbursed, people are using then the medicinal cannabis pharmaceutical route, or they're using the adult use or the black market to provide themselves with necessary...
If I can just add a little bit there. So, I know that we cannot extrapolate too much from the US markets because they are on the medical side, because they are wellness markets, right? So I get that. But, and it is true that when you look at those markets that were medical that go recreational, normally grow, 3-4 times. In the case of Germany, it could be 20 times, but that's because the German medical market is less developed. But what we are seeing, those wellness markets that went recreational in the US, is that they are declining, right? For example, I was looking at the numbers for Colorado, Arizona. Recently, in the last year, they are down about 40%. Arizona, which legalized about a year ago, the number of patients registered or active, it's down also about 40%. So that makes me wonder what happens in Europe, right? And I start with a question, with the first reminder is that it's not 4%, it's 0.1%, right? So we're starting from a much lower base. So I think that the European markets on the medical side, even if we go recreational like Germany, will continue to develop. Obviously, reimbursement, how easy it is for doctors to prescribe, that triangle between patient, doctor, and pharmacy, how that works, that will develop how those markets continue to grow. So in general, even if these markets in Europe go recreational, I would assume that medical, because it's so little developed and they have reimbursement, more so than in North America, we almost have none in the US for cannabis, I would assume that these medical markets would continue to develop. That said, the only thing I always bring up when we talk about medical is that, I go back sometimes and look at that documentary from Sanjay Gupta on CNN. He shows these families, with children with brain tumors or other types of cancers, where cannabis was helping them to, in some cases, apparently stop the tumor or even reverse it. But unfortunately, we don't hear that anymore, right? Because most of the companies, and it's the way these markets work, most of the money from those companies that were doing well in medical, they went recreational, and they stopped, in my opinion, focusing on the medical market, right? And that's That's a pity in a way, because that's been lost. A lot of these big Canadian LPs, 4 or 5 years ago in their slide decks, they had pages and pages of clinical trials. Now they don't have anything in that regard, right? So in the case of Europe, I hope the story is different, because obviously some of these medical companies, I hope and suppose that there will be dominant players, there will be active players in the future recreational market also, but I hope that they will still be involved in research, in clinical trials, and in moving forward the state of knowledge in the industry on medical cannabis, right? Or it could be the same. Or if that doesn't happen, it could be what's happening in the U.S., right? That recreational will go up, and then medical starts to go down. And the last thing I'll say, and maybe Sascha has a view on this, is whether, are we going to have a domino effect in Europe, right? If Germany legalizes, right, in Massachusetts, if I go from New Jersey to Massachusetts, drive across the state border, it's very simple to bring it back. Here, obviously, I would assume it will be very simple from people from France to go to Stuttgart or from Denmark to Hamburg, but that will probably, the jobs that are created, the tax revenue in Germany, may push other markets to go recreational in Europe. I don't know. But if that happens, what's going to happen with those medical markets that we're talking about, right? Whether it's Spain, France, or even Germany.
If I may, so, well, first of all, there is still a page with clinical trials on the Tilray website. So yes, we are committed to medical. And the domino effect is actually happening with medical right now, right? So if we look at the European landscape, there's big markets not being fully regulated. France is one example. Spain just last week agreed on a path forward to a medical legalization, if you wish. So, and we still feel it's the stepstone also to a potential regulation on recreational use. So we are kind of focused on both things, right? So there's still room to grow in medical. There's still a domino effect on medical. France, I think, will be the biggest opening happening March next year. And then recreational, for sure, will also have a domino effect at some point. There are smaller markets waiting for Germany to take a pathway to follow that, and then for sure other markets will also consider that. But again, I feel still medical will be the first step to then go recreational. I doubt that we will see markets going recreational directly.
But in the case of Germany, do you think, can I ask, just in the case of Germany, if Germany goes recreational in 2024, do you expect the medical market to continue to develop strongly?
I actually expect a greater dynamic, because what you see in the German market is still a lot of stigma. You see access problems which should vanish once it's legalized. So I actually don't see the two competing. You have that self-paying segment on flower product that might then migrate from left to right, but they do it already in the illicit market. So honestly, I do see more growth to come once you would have destigmatized the cannabis plant as such.
So yeah, Nick, I know medical cannabis is a personal cause as well for you because of your daughter. So I was wondering, personally, are you concerned that medical cannabis is going to be less of a commercial focus, or do you expect it, like Sascha, to actually get tailwinds from rec?
My personal view is I think it will get tailwinds. It's all about overcoming the stigma, as we know. And access to patients, doctors, they need clinical trials. And a number of our clients who are exhibitors and sponsors here today are making incredible progress with some of their early stage clinical trials. The results are astonishing, but not to the people in this room, because it's what we all knew. So my hope is that if Germany does go the way it clearly is going, that by destigmatizing and regularizing in the biggest economy in Europe, the plant, doctors will be much more interested in prescribing, and therefore they will want more clinical trials, and therefore, hopefully, Tilray are a fabulous example of the work that's being done alongside preparing for adult use, because why wouldn't you? These companies are in business to make money, but certainly the London market is still very keen on life sciences companies. That's the positioning of the companies that have listed in the cannabis space, and the companies that we're currently working with are all in that medical trial, medical market. So I really hope that patients will benefit as the market evolves and matures, which is what's happening.
So we've talked a lot about Germany, and then we name-dropped some countries in passing, but I wanted your view on European countries in terms of market.
Yeah, so what goes for Germany in estimating the market goes also for Europe. So again, the same reasoning what I did earlier on the German market. Well, then you come at the European market, which is 5,000 tons. And of course, when will that happen? There will definitely be a domino effect, as Sascha said, starting with some smaller countries, Luxembourg, Malta, Portugal probably is clearly waiting what's happening with, on the German front. I think also Macron has signaled before that he's willing to go to adult use if Germany would be. So we'll see how all that evolves. So very interesting times. And in 10 years' time, probably we will hear sitting here with a fully adult use market and lots of price wars going on everywhere.
What about Switzerland?
Oh yes, sorry, no, sorry, yes. There are definitely, in Switzerland have made actually the start with an adult use market, 50 cantons who can each prescribe 3,000 existing recreational uses with recreational cannabis. So there's 150,000 consumers in Switzerland already. Now that's only a fraction of the market. Now once these 3,000 are full, I'm sure that there will be pressure from those who missed that boat and not on that list of 3,000 in every canton. Well, they'll be pushing for more. And you see the same happening in probably the same trends as well in Austria. I think it's interesting to see actually currently is Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands. So it's kind of a oil patch seeming to expand across Europe. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, or the domino effect, as someone said. I'm sure it's going to happen that as it happened, for instance, in the U.S. with Rhode Island, when people go cross-border to buy, for sure that's a pressure for legislators, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. As Pablo mentioned earlier, well, if you're living in France or Belgium and you're not, you have no access to adult use cannabis, it's just only an hour away. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the differences with the US is that with the EU, there's a lot more cross-border potential. So what does that change, for instance, as a business for Tilray, that you can import from another country much more easily than even cross-state in the US?
Yeah, I think that's also what German policy understands, that they would need to import from other countries. 400 tons or 1,000 tons, I think it's not realistic to have them all cultivated in Germany, so we will see traffic, hopefully, but that's maybe also the biggest policy question, because you need to bring that through the European treaties, and I think that's where policy is right now busy with. What we do see that on European level, there's much more interaction between health ministers, so we as Tilray do also participate in the European Medical Cannabis Association, and I happen to be the chairman there. So we see how European institutions and policymakers are talking between themselves. So I do see a European movement. I wouldn't see Europe going with a joint legislation, but we do see them talking and tolerating each other. Right? So
it's going to be really interesting to see how they deal with the convention. You know, going back to basics, how are you going to move product into Germany from France or from more likely Portugal or, yeah. That's the one thing that nobody seems to, I can't find the answer yet as to what Germany is actually going to do and how it's going to achieve what it wants to. I'm sure it will, but the political will within Europe is where Germany goes, everyone else follows. So hopefully, you know, we will see that find a solution. But to me, that's still the biggest unanswered question in the whole story of movement.
Right. I mean, just a quick comment there. So, you know, we're talking about 20 tons right now in Germany. I think around 3 or 4 are produced domestically. Everything is imported. We're going to get to, 400 tons eventually. You will have to bring that from other markets. But imagine the size of production in those markets, whether it's Portugal, France, or somewhere else, right? Spain. So that's why I say that those countries eventually will have to legalize rec.
Yeah.
Because how can you have that amount of production there and not be selling domestic?
So we need to wrap up, and I want to say, well, we didn't do much actual forecasting, but we did the main thing that's important when forecasting, which is putting the frame into place and asking the right questions that you need to look at and what to track. So thank you very much.